Hello everybody, today I'm going to tell you about the story of Dante's Inferno, as well as a description of the 9 layers of hell that he talks about in the story. It's wild to me that this story isn't as covered as you think it would be. Because between the different layers of hell and stuff like the 7 deadly sins, it's one of the most referenced pieces of media ever. See, Dante's Inferno is a part of a greater work known as the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy contains 3 parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, which line up with Hell, Purgatory, and Heaven, respectively. Although Inferno's the one everyone remembers because it's the one with the creepy demons and the suffering and all that stuff. To understand Dante's Inferno, I need to give you a brief description of Dante himself. Dante Alighieri was born somewhere around the time of 1265 in what is now Italy. Dante became a poet and became particularly fascinated with old ideas of both Greece and Rome. Without getting into too much detail, because both you probably don't care and I don't think I really understand it as well as I like to think I might, Dante was alive during the time of the Holy Roman Empire, which, making it very, very simplified and dumbed down, there was the Pope and then an emperor, and the two were having fights back and forth over which one should maintain power. Dante was a very devout and firm Catholic, so he sided with the Pope, and whenever he lost a particular battle, he was banished from his home city. See, this was before Italy became a nation, so the way that it worked is people were much more tied to cities than they were their own country, and Dante himself was from the city of Florence. So Dante was exiled from Florence and pretty much lived off the graces of those who enjoyed his poetry, and it was during this time of exile, around the year 1317, that he published the Divine Comedy. The original title of this book was just The Comedy. See, the word comedy is very different now than it was at the time of his writing this, or in the historical connotation. Comedy was a story that followed a natural order. In other words, bad things happen to the bad people, good things happen to the good people, and we can all feel good about it. So originally the title of this story was just The Comedy, or in other words, this is going to be a long story and everyone's going to turn out the way that you think they should probably turn out. So he brought the comedy to one of his friends who was also a poet, and after reading it, his friend said it was so marvelous that he should rename it The Divine Comedy, which, talk about hyping your boy up. Now, something I need to make very clear here moving forward with this. A lot on the channel, I talk about things that are serious inside of the idea of Christianity, or in other words, things that actual Christians believe or in the Bible. This is not that. You see, Dante, who really liked Greek and Roman mythology, took a bunch of characters and inspiration from those stories and then just threw them together with Christianity and came up with all these descriptions of hell and its 9 layers. And as we're going to see, and I hate even invoking this phrase out loud, but a lot of this was biblical fan fiction. Dante used a biblical setting to not only put down people he didn't like literally half of the rebuttals through this is just by naming certain historical figures and saying that they're in hell. For example, if me and you were in an argument and I was like, oh yeah, well, I wrote this book and guess what? Your mom's in hell. So top that. And I'm not kidding. Remember how I said that the reason he was exiled and wrote this book in the first place was because his side lost a battle to someone else? Well, he just says all the heroes of that other army are in the certain layers of hell that he describes, but we'll get into that. Because the story itself was, pretty divisive for that reason, a lot of people looked down on it and it wasn't really given a lot of praise at the time. However, hundreds of years later, whenever people began to read it, it became incredibly influential and the famous story that it's known for today. To give you an idea, in 1945, whenever Italy was in World War II and about to make their last stand against the Allies, they considered bringing the bones of Dante to the battlefield in order to aid them, because that's how much he meant to Italy's spirit. And also, in research, in May of this year, 2021, they had a virtual hearing for Dante in order to historically and symbolically undo his exile from Florence. So a few months ago, there was a trial for this dead poet who invented the 9 described layers of hell, and I wasn't invited for some reason, and I'm gonna stay mad about that. So because this is such an influential story, and because it's the start of October, and what's spookier than hell, I read Dante's Inferno so that I could come to you, not only describe the story, the layers of hell that not a lot of people talk about, some of the symbolism, and my problems with the story, because as we're gonna see, there's a lot of them. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about this. And you may be asking, what is this? And the funny thing is, I don't even know. What a lot of you probably don't know is that whenever I record ads for this channel, I'm not always sure of what ad's going to go with what video. So whatever's happening over here is a total surprise to me as much as it is you, so let's find out. A wallet that you can always trust to keep your cards and cash secure at all times, and that's why today I'm here to tell you about the Ridge wallet. This wallet's got all my cards in it because whenever I started the ad with them a couple months ago and I put my stuff in here for the ad, I never took it out because I just like the wallet. I have the titanium black model because I just like the slick color of it, but the Ridge wallet comes in everything from silver to this sort of burnt chrome finish and dozens of different designs and styles. Like for example, mine has a money clip on the outside of it because it's sturdy and does an excellent job at holding in whatever cash I need. And the wallet itself can hold up to 12 cards, which I don't know about you, but I've never been in a situation where I carry 12 cards on myself every single day. But if you do, the Ridge wallet's got you covered. It's a super durable wallet that's even made with an RFID blocking unit in it that keeps your cards safe from digital pickpocketers, yeah. But not only all of that, Ridge is so confident, as am I, that you'll like the wallet, that if you get one, you have 45 days to return it and get your money back. I suggest the Ridge wallet to you because I've been using it and I absolutely love it. So if you're interested, I've got this discount code for you today. If you go to the link in the description at ridge.com/Wendigoon and use the discount code Wendigoon, you'll be able to get your order for 10% off. Thank you so much to Ridge for sponsoring this video. It really does mean a lot, and I really do like your product. Thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you check out the link in the description. Hope you check out Ridge, and we are back to the video. Isn't that interesting? Now you know more than I do. You, watching this video, know more about this video than I do currently recording it. Isn't that just weird? And speaking of weird, let's get into Dante's journey through hell. But first of all, and as always, thank you for watching. The story opens whenever Dante wakes up in the middle of a dark forest. He's not sure how he got there, however he figures it's best to write about the situation that he's in. He sees a way out of a forest up a hillside, however whenever he tries to climb, he's attacked by various animals, including a lion and a wolf. Moments later, Dante sees a figure out in the woods who he calls out to before the figure identifies himself as Virgil, the Roman poet. Now in real life, Virgil was a great inspiration for Dante and someone he looked up to. As a matter of fact, throughout the entire book, Dante refers to Virgil as master. Virgil tells Dante that there's no way to get out up that hillside that he just tried to, and that the only way will be when one day the Greyhound comes to chase the wolves away. Now, while this video, I hope, is going to be a decent substitute for the story itself and the cool parts everyone talks about, there is no way I'd be able to cover all of the symbolism within the story. However, some pieces like this are a bit more obvious. So whenever Virgil says that one day the Greyhound will come to chase the wolves away, that is in reference to something known as Judgment Day, or the idea that within Christianity, at the end of time, Christ and God will return to earth and get rid of the demons, Lucifer, and his whole entourage. So the symbolism of the Greyhound chasing away the wolves so that souls can freely climb the mountain is in reference to that. Virgil informs Dante that he is now woken up within the pit of the underworld and that the only way out is a walk through hell. Dante takes the news surprisingly well, and then asks Virgil how he knows this. Virgil says that an angel known as Beatrice gave him the information herself. Beatrice is the woman who Dante loved in real life, and now in his story he's written her in as a holy messenger. And we're going to see a lot more of Dante incorporating themes from his personal life into this story. Virgil tells Dante that he can only take Dante through hell itself, and then after that it is part of Dante's journey to walk through purgatory and then heaven, the other two parts of Divine Comedy. However, Virgil says that he himself cannot do it because he is a pagan spirit and therefore cannot walk into glory. Another thing about this is this story is also used by Dante in order to get across a lot of his religious beliefs. Like, for example, he says here that Virgil is a good man. As a matter of fact, Dante thinks of him as a great man. However, Virgil's a Roman poet and was born and died before Jesus Christ. So according to Dante, that just sucks for him because now he's stuck down here in the underworld forever. See, as we're going to see in a bit, Dante ranks the different sins, or specifically the 9 different sins, by how bad that they are, and then puts each of them in deeper layers of hell respectively. However, someone like Virgil, who wasn't guilty of any sins in his life, is still cursed to the underworld just because he lived before Christ. So this is just the cards that he's been dealt. So Dante's scared that he's going to have to walk all the way through hell, to which Virgil scorns him and says that this message that Beatrice gave him was given directly by God. So God himself wants Dante to get through this journey, so Dante better get on this journey. So Dante follows Virgil through the woods until they come across a large gate. Also, there's several different translations of this story. The translation that I read, people said was pretty good. So written above the large gate is this inscription: "Through me the way is to the city dolent. Through me the way is to eternal dole. Through me the way among the people lost. Justice incited my sublime creator, created me divine omnipotence, the highest wisdom and the primal love. Before me there were no created things, only eternal, and I eternal last. Abandon all hope, ye who enter in." This is, of course, the entrance to the gates of hell. Now, most of you have probably heard that last phrase, "abandon all hope, ye who enter in," but the other lines are equally as interesting. For one, it opens up and says that through me is the way to eternal dole or eternal suffering. We get all that. But the part where it says that justice is the reason I was created, and that my sublime creator did this as a form of omnipotence and, quote, primal love, is saying that everything that we're about to see in the story and everything that we come across is just and what these people deserve for the sins that they have committed. Or at least what Dante says that God says they deserve for what they committed. And a common theme that we're going to see through this story is that sinners get exactly what they deserved in this never-ending punishment. So Dante and Virgil walk in through the gate and make their way into hell. Upon entry, Dante says that he can hear every language and accent crying out at once. Now, before they even get to any of the layers of hell, literally on the path to get to the beginning of it, they come across this giant sea of lost souls. Virgil explains to Dante that these are people who didn't follow anything in life. They weren't good, they weren't bad, they simply were nothing. And among them is several fallen angels who also didn't commit themselves to God or Lucifer and simply existed. All of them, literally billions of people from all across human history, are chasing a giant blank banner, which is symbolic of the fact that they never really followed anything in life, so now they're cursed in this sort of in-between state of the real world and hell to just chase after a meaningless flag forever. While they're doing this, they're constantly being stung by wasps and hornets, and it says worms all across the ground eat the tears and blood that come out of them. The idea being that people who lived meaningless lives are committed to an eternity of meaningless suffering. Eventually, Virgil and Dante walk to a river in which a bunch of people are waiting on a sort of dock. Dante can hear people around him swearing and cursing about the situation that they're in, as Virgil tells him this is the river Acheron. And then, as they're standing there, Charon of Greek mythology rose up on a boat. Now, this is the start of something we're going to see a ton of, where Dante incorporates figures from mythology and then puts him in his Christian narrative. And just like in Greek mythology, Charon is someone who rows dead souls down the path to the afterlife. He tells Virgil and Dante that they are not allowed to get on because Dante is a still living person and that's not how this works. To which Virgil just goes, "We are on a journey from God." And Charon goes, "Oh, all right, get in." As all the souls are gathered onto the boat, he tells all of them that now is a good time to start panicking and be afraid, and then tells Dante that he's not supposed to be here. And then shortly after that, Virgil leans over to Dante and he's like, "Hey, I mean, he said you weren't supposed to be here, so that's a good thing. So whenever you do eventually die, you probably won't end up here. So cheer up, because Dante's terrified through all of this. So much so that an earthquake happens, to which Dante panics and passes out. Whenever he comes to from passing out, he sees that the river they are going down is now on the edge of a cliff face. After looking over the cliff face, Dante can see what appears to be an endless spiral going down, and what he's actually viewing is the spiral of hell itself. Each layer down being a different level attributed to a different kind of sin. The noise he hears sounds like one perpetual loud noise, which Virgil explains to him is every soul crying out and screaming at once. So then eventually the boat moves on and arrives at the first layer of hell, Limbo. As soon as they come into this area, Dante says that the screaming stops and instead it's just the sound of sighing, and as he describes it, sorrows without any form of torment. Remember that thing I said earlier about Virgil, how he was a good guy, he just existed before Christ, so oops. Well, this is where all of those people go. People who were good people but simply didn't follow the rules of Christ, were before Christ, or something like being unbaptized, which was a really big deal in Catholicism at the time. Essentially, this stage 1 limbo is like Earth, only people don't die. And that's it. That's the only difference. There's no torment. No one's really being tortured. It's just the lack of hope and kind of the idea of constant nothingness, or this is just how things are forever. So people roam and go about life with just existence. And again, these aren't people who's really done anything bad. They're just kind of here. Dante asks Virgil if anyone has ever gone from this limbo into heaven, and Virgil says that a lot did whenever Jesus died on the cross. According to Virgil, whenever Jesus died, he came down here into this first plane of hell within limbo, grabbed several of the Old Testament figures and brought them into heaven. Among these, a few of them are Adam, Abel, Noah, Moses, Abraham, David, and Rachel, just to name a few. Not only that, Virgil says that whenever Jesus came into this first layer of hell, it caused such an earthquake and rumble that it caused a fracture to go all the way to the bottom of the hell, which we'll see more effects of as we get into the story. While walking through this layer of hell, the two of them come across Homer, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan, all famous writers from Greek and Roman history. As the four of them are walking, they ask Virgil and Dante to walk along with them. Now, this brings us to a detail of this story that I haven't really mentioned up until now, but it's a little bit pretentious. And I'm saying that as someone who's making a YouTube video about a story that you could easily just read for yourself. Like, for example, these four men I just said are famous figures from poetry history who Dante's big fans of, including Virgil himself. So what happens is the four of them walk along and they're like, Virgil and the famous Dante, why don't you two come with us? And while they're walking, the other four are like, Dante, you're such a great writer. I can't believe how wonderful you are. And now look at you walking through hell. You know what? You're one of us. You're one of the greatest writers in all of history. Do you see what I mean by biblical fan fiction? So then as the six of them are now walking together, they come to this great castle wall. And whenever they walk through it, it's like this beautiful meadow. And while walking through it, we see figures such as Democritus, Hector, and Electra. Now, if those names sound weird to you, that's because Democritus was a real person who existed in Greek history, along with Hector and Electra, two characters from Greek mythology. And Dante does a lot of that in this story. He takes fictitious characters and combines them with real characters. Another character that he sees here sitting on a sort of throne is Caesar, who Dante really, really likes, but again, he was born before Christ, so he's technically in the first layer of hell. And whenever they get to the end of the meadow, the four people who were with Virgil and Dante stay there as they continue on their journey. And that's another weird detail, like the four of them come up and they're like, hey, can we join you guys? Wow, Dante, you're so awesome. All right, bye now. So then they continue onto their path until they begin what is the true different layers of hell. While walking, they come to someone known as Minos, which is again a character from Greek mythology. Just like in his story within Greek mythology, Minos is here to judge souls and determine where they go in the underworld. Dante says that whenever a soul walks up to Minos, they can't help but confess everything that they've done in life, to which Minos then throws them to the appropriate layer of hell that they belong in. Minos points out the fact that Dante's not supposed to be here because he's a still living person. Virgil says they're on a mission from God, and they just walk by him. Again, similar to what we saw earlier on the boat, and something we're going to see a lot more of. Conflict rises. Virgil says God sent us. Conflict unrises. So after this, Dante and Virgil continue on their path and come to the second layer of hell, lust. This layer is consumed with great winds like that of a hurricane, and people who are standing are constantly pushed back and forth, never allowed to rest by the winds that they are facing, and some people are thrown around so much that they're just floating, bobbing up and down in the air. Every single layer that we're going to see of punishment has something to do with the way they lived in their real life. So the idea with this one is that people who were torn asunder and blown about by the passions of love are now forced to spend eternity quite literally being blown about by mighty winds. Another interesting thing that happens is in every layer of hell, Dante asks Virgil to point out to him famous figures, and then Virgil's like, oh yeah, well that's that guy, he's famous. There's also that guy over there, he's also famous. So like when walking through here, Virgil says, oh yeah, those two, those are Paris and Helen from the Trojan War. And also that character over there, that's Dido. Dido is a character from a play that Virgil wrote. So like I said, the thing that Dante combines fictional elements along with real world elements, but now he has Virgil, a writer of a story, being like, oh yeah, that person, that's from that play I wrote. No, I don't see what's weird about this at all. And then continuing to look at people, he sees the Mistress of Babel and Cleopatra. The reason he put Cleopatra here, not only because historically she's famous for lusty behavior, but also, like most 17 to 23-year-old males, including myself, Dante really had a thing for Rome. That's why Caesar was on a big throne in the past level. Like, sure, he has to be in hell because he didn't like Jesus, but he was still the leader of Rome, and Dante liked that a whole lot. So as we're going to see, people who were not nice to Rome, Dante is not nice to in this story, and Cleopatra had a very big hand in tearing apart some of the leaders of Rome, so she's in the second layer of hell. Dante gets really sad at seeing people in this condition, and then asks to talk to two of them, who explain that they were lovers in real life or the life before this life, and said that he was her husband's brother, and that one day the two of them were talking and reading romantic stories and then kissed and then had a passionate affair, to which the husband killed both of them. So now, because they were lusty and broke the bonds of marriage and all that, they're here on the second level. And then in response to this, Dante passes out again, which I mind you is the second time. The way the story works is Dante falls asleep and we wake up in our next location. And third, counting if technically the opening to this whole story was him just waking up in the woods. I know I'm being critical of a story written in the 1300s, and a story that admittedly was incredibly monumental when it came to ideas of fictional storytelling. However, I can't help myself. Dante then wakes up seemingly having been carried by Virgil in the third layer of hell, gluttony. In this level, it's constantly pouring a mixture of rain, sleet, snow, and hail, so it's constantly uncomfortable. People are being pelted with ice, and then the most uncomfortable thing about it is Cerberus, the three-headed dog, is sprinting around and tearing people to shreds. But people can't die, so what happens is Cerberus will pick someone up, bite him in half, rip him to pieces, throw him, and then they just lay there in pieces and either heal up over the course of however many eons or just lay there like that. Also, an interesting detail is that Dante describes Cerberus looks pretty rough, like cut up and pieces of its stomach cut open and stuff like that. That'll be explained later. And as Cerberus sees the pair and begins running at them, Virgil grabs a bunch of dirt and throws it into each of Cerberus's mouths. Cerberus's mouths, whatever. Which, like, did he do it all at once? Like, does he have 3 arms, or was it like really quick, or whatever? They sneak by, and as they're sneaking by, someone sets up and identifies themselves as Chiaco and talks to Dante, and that's when he explains everyone on this level committed acts of gluttony in life, so now we're forced to always be half eaten by this Cerberus creature. And what most people do is they lay down and play dead so that Cerberus doesn't get to them. Dante then asks Chiaco if he can tell him what's happening to Florence back on Earth, to which Chiaco says that all he can see is Florence's future and that there's going to be a lot of war and bloodshed. This is the start of something we're going to see a lot of as we get into the deeper layers of hell, but Dante is weirdly concerned with like the modern political climate of the city of Florence, considering the fact he's on a message from God to walk through hell and heaven itself, but he keeps being like, how's the election going back home? It also brings up another interesting point, because as they're leaving, Kyoko asked if Dante will write about him that he may be remembered. Now, while on the one hand, it's kind of pretentious for Dante to write in his story that the one thing these suffering souls in hell want is for I, the great Dante, to talk about them, but it does open up this interesting idea from a horror perspective of these souls are so damned and trapped down here, the only thing that they can hope is that they'll be written in books that they can never read. As they're walking away, Dante asks the question of what happens to these souls whose bodies have been so torn to pieces. Virgil says that on Judgment Day, again there's Judgment Day mentioned again, that everyone's soul will be reunited with their body and they will be in a state of perfection. Dante asks the question, for the souls down here in hell, while perfection may sound really cool in heaven, what does perfect mean in hell? And Virgil's like, well, that means their suffering will be perfect. In other words, a whole lot worse than it is right now. See, and this is what's really interesting about reading this story in the modern age. Any modern story that you would look at that would be in the setting, the story would go from a state of fear or whatever negative emotion to a state of pity or remorse or love or acceptance or whatever. However, that was not the traits that was becoming, at least to Dante at the time. Instead, Dante's journey or character arc through this story is going from pitying these souls to being happy that this is the punishment they're receiving, because as the inscription on the gates of hell said at the beginning, this is just and perfect punishment. So according to the story, it's good that as it goes on, Dante begins to lose emotion and remorse for these people, instead viewing it as a perfect form of punishment that we should all be proud of. So in this moment, whenever Virgil says, well, their suffering will be perfect, that's not supposed to be a bad thing. That's the wise Virgil being like, now don't you worry, readers. It's going to get worse. So anyway, they continue on their path and get to the fourth layer of hell, greed. As soon as they come into this fourth layer, they come across the Roman god of Pluto, who is standing there worshiping Satan. Again, it's weird to imagine a Greek god worshiping the Christian devil, but whatever. Pluto threatens to attack them, to which Virgil says they're on a path from God, and Pluto just collapses and they walk on by. From walking along the path, sort of along this cliffside, Dante looks down and sees what seems to be a sea of people constantly running into each other. He describes it as two separate waves splashing against each other violently over and over again. He sees that a few of them are bald, which was common of friars at the time, and he asks Virgil if these are in fact members of the church. To which Virgil says these are members of the church, half of them, and the other half are people who simply hoarded money and didn't give it to others and were greedy throughout their entire lives, now being forced to constantly fight and bicker forever, just as they fought over wealth back on Earth. Dante asks if there's anyone down there who he would recognize, and Virgil points out that each of them are so disfigured from hundreds and thousands of years of constant fighting that no one is recognizable anymore. Everyone's faces have been so obliterated and smashed in that they all just look like one identical mass of flesh, always fighting over nothing. Just as, according to Dante, there was no reason for them to fight so desperately for wealth back on Earth. So they continue across this path, and then they come to the edge of a lagoon, which is the beginning of the fifth layer of hell, wrath. And I need to clarify, this isn't violence yet. Violence will show up later. This is specifically people who were just angry or mean all the time. So they come to this lagoon, which Virgil points out to him is at the end of the river Styx. And in this sort of mud broth, there are these naked people who are constantly punching and hitting each other and trying to push each other down in the mud so that they can come up on top. Virgil also says to Dante that wherever he sees bubbles coming up in the mud, those aren't vents or anything. Those are people who are so deep under the mud that whenever they scream or cry, it just comes up as a bubble. So they walk along the bank of this river, which again is just filled with people fighting, punching, and pushing each other down, until they come to a tower that has 2 lights glowing at the top of it. Dante notices, and in the distance he sees a beacon flashing and asks Virgil what it means. Virgil says that this is the place that one can go across the river Styx, and that the 2 lights on top are a signal for whoever's driving the boat that there are 2 souls who need picked up. I think it is hilarious that in the middle of hell, after the waves of people punching each other, and now in this muddy lagoon where people are fighting for eternity, that hell has like a Morse code signaling system to let the boat driver know how many passengers he needs to pick up. So then a boat comes up, which is being driven by Phlegyas, another character from Greek mythology, who then lets the 2 get on the boat and begins driving them down the river Styx, or driving, like steering, boating, whatever. As they're floating down the river, again, that is totally filled with people fighting, punching, and screaming all the time, someone pops up and begins to ask Dante who he is and where he's from. Dante's kind of like grossed out by it, and Virgil pushes him off the side of the boat. And then as they're floating down the river, Dante sees that they all start like making fun of that guy for trying to have a conversation and then getting pushed off the boat. So the dude just starts biting his flesh and ripping out pieces. And Virgil explains to Dante that in life, several of these people were very haughty and prideful. So now down here in the river Styx, they're constantly biting and bickering at each other, and in shame he's losing his mind and ripping skin off. Along this journey, Dante sees what looks like glowing red buildings out in the distance. Virgil says that this is a place known as the City of Dis, and that red glow he's seeing is from the fires from within the city itself. See, the way hell's been structured up until this point is it's a sort of trail that they're constantly walking through. And Virgil explains to Dante that the City of Dis, within it is the further layers of hell, and that every layer of hell after this is within the city itself. So in other words, they have to get into the city. Whenever they row up to the gate, crowds of fallen angels come and crowd on the gate and notice that Dante's still alive, and they don't like it. They're like, no, you gross, get out of here, we don't want you. Virgil starts to do his whole thing again where he says we're on a message from God, but these fallen angels who have in the past rebelled against God don't want to hear it, so they just lock the city gate. During this time, Dante gets kind of panicky, to which he asks Virgil if this has ever been done before. To which Virgil replies that one time he was sent to the bottom layer of hell to bring a soul out for a Greek witch, and he never elaborates on it. As they're waiting there at the gate of the city, Dante looks up on the columns of the city and sees the 3 Furies come out covered in blood and snakes. The 3 Furies then begin yelling for Medusa, to which Virgil panics and tells Dante to cover his eyes because if a soul is turned to stone down here, including Dante, he'll never be able to go back out. As this is happening and as Dante's panicking, he hears what sounds like a mighty roar before turning around and seeing an angel, not a fallen angel, like a heavenly angel, walking across the river Styx that they had just come down. As the angel's walking on the water mud thing of the river Styx, it says all the souls are being pushed to the sides of the river to make room for it. The angel then walks up to the gate of the City of Dis, taps on it, the gate flies open, and the angel walks in, and all of the fallen angels are cowering in fear, as the angel says these 2 are on a mission from God, and if anyone tries to hinder their journey, the same fate that befell Cerberus will happen to them. Now, this is maybe my favorite part of the story from a storytelling perspective. We've seen throughout this entire ride so far that Virgil keeps saying, oh, we're on a mission from God, and there's no proof of it. And then the first time that someone doesn't listen to him, an angel shows up, blows open the city gates, and threatens to take out everyone. And not only that, the thing earlier I mentioned about Cerberus being torn up and part of his stomach being ripped open implies that at one point Cerberus tried to hinder a journey from God and was brutally wounded for it. And then after this, the angel just leaves without saying a word to Virgil or Dante. This also, as you could imagine, renews Dante's faith in that he's going to be safe along his journey. So then stepping through the gates into the City of Dis, the 2 come into the 6th layer of hell, heresy. This is a thing that isn't as common today as it was in the 1300s, but short version is that heresy is straying others from the path of God or away from truth by means of some form of deception or misguidance. Like, for example, Epicurus is down here, who was a Greek philosopher that told his followers there was no afterlife, and in other words, kind of brought them down this path of nihilism away from godly living, and that's why he's here. So what's the torture in the 6th layer of hell? Well, it is these tombs that are cut out of rock and laid along each other that people are laying down inside of, and they're constantly being stoked with flames, essentially making a burning stone coffin that the heretics have to lay down in. And these fallen angels of the area make sure that everyone's laying down and participating in the suffering. While walking through this, Dante asks Virgil if he can ask any of the souls if they know what's happening in Florence, because only Dante could be walking through one of the most tragic and horrific ideas of eternal suffering imaginable, and being like, I really have to know about how the war effort's going back home. He begins asking around and comes to someone known as Farinata, who in the real world had a feud with Dante's family, the two families being on opposite sides of that whole Pope-Emperor war I talked about earlier. However, to his surprise, this soul asks Dante if he has any knowledge of what's happening in Florence. The soul then explains to Dante that the way it works is that souls in hell can see the past and the future, but not the present. This in itself is its own kind of form of torture. For example, imagine if you were concerned about your family and all you could see is that 100 years from now, like, your house won't be there or the country will be destroyed, but you have no clue what's happening right now. This also explains the guy on tier 3 who, whenever Dante asked about Florence, was like, I don't know, I just see bloodshed and destruction in the future. As Dante's talking to him, someone named Cavalcante sets up in the tomb next to him and recognizes Dante. See, this guy is the father of one of Dante's friends, so whenever he sees Dante, he says, do you know where my son is? Is he still alive? To which Dante, when referring to him, refers to him in the past tense, saying something to the effect of, oh, well, maybe he hadn't lived that way. And the father, inferring from this that his son is dead, begins crying and then seeps back down into his tomb. That's like a weirdly human moment for this story. Everyone's so concerned with politics and kingship. To have a father set up from eternal torture just ask if his son's okay, and whenever he figures out he's dead, to see him crying as he lays back into his burning coffin is a weirdly human moment. But forget all that, because Dante wants to know more about Florence. So he begins asking Farinata again about Florence and what's going on there, but again, the guy doesn't have a lot of answers. So Dante finally asks, well, who else do you know is suffering in this tier of hell? To which the soul says King Frederick II is down here. Now that probably doesn't mean anything to anyone right now, but remember that whole war, how it's Pope versus Emperor that happened like in history, and Dante was on the Pope side? Well, King Frederick II was one of the kings on the Emperor side. So for him to write this story and to be like, oh yeah, that king you love so much, well, he's in hell with the heretics because I don't like him and he's a bad person. So yeah, after this, Dante and Virgil continue their walking and come across a giant cliff face that has a noxious smell coming up from it. Virgil tells Dante that they should probably get used to it before they just keep walking, so the two of them decide to take a seat in front of a giant vault. On the front of the vault it says, Pope Anastasius I hold, whom out of the right way Photinus drew. Again, this is one of the popes from history that Dante does not like, so he places him in his own vault in between the 6th and 7th layer of hell, and he never says what's happening to him in there. It's just like, hey, here's a vault, there's a pope in here, and that's all you get to know about it. Thankfully, because I was getting kind of confused myself at this point in the story, Virgil uses this resting time to explain to Dante how hell works, or at least how it works up until this point. He explains to Dante that the way the 9 circles work is they progressively get worse, and the way that they are ranked is by how many people you're damaging or what kind of damage you do. For example, things like lust and gluttony will rarely hurt someone else, whereas those are pretty much just vices that someone has. So since it's more of a form of unrighteous living instead of actively harming other people, that's why they're on layers 2 and 3. Whereas things like greed and wrath are more often or more capable of hurting other people, so they're a little bit more down. The reason the city of Dis is so important And the reason that layer 6, the heretics, was so much more brutal than anything that we'd seen before is because layer 6 marks the beginning of people actively sinning against someone else. See, the first 5 layers were all about people who just had vices or lived a certain way, and while they could hurt other people, that wasn't exactly true all the time. It's just possible to happen. So all of them are outside of the city of Dis. Of course, they're in horrible conditions, like the greedy people punching each other all the time, and the snow following as Cerberus rips people to shreds. However, they're not being tortured actively. They're just in a bad place and they're suffering. However, from layer 6 on, remember how I mentioned there's people laying down in tombs and they're on fire, and the fallen angels around the city are the ones conducting it? Yeah, that's how the rest of it is from here. It goes from a state of misery to active suffering all the time. The reason being, everyone within the city of Dis, so tier 6 to tier 9, are all people who hurt others in their lives. Virgil also explains to Dante that God's most hated sins are that of fraud and deceit because they specifically abuse love. Remember, everything that I'm talking about is centered around the idea of the love of God, and everyone suffering down here is because they ruin that love in the world above. So the people who most abuse love, or in other words, the sins that God hates the most, is people who betrayed love in some regard as a means to get what they want, so they are in the deepest parts of hell. He also explains to Dante that the final 3 layers, 7, 8, and 9, are all subdivided. I'll get to the specifics of each one as we get to them, but he tells Dante up front that layer 7 is broken up into 3 parts. So having rested, Virgil and Dante continue their journey into layer 7, violence. As they're walking along this path, a minotaur comes in their way, to which Virgil insults it. The minotaur goes crazy and starts thrashing, and they just walk by. So again, threat, Virgil says words, no threat. Dante asks Virgil, because, they're on their way to the 7th layer of hell, where these paths that they're walking along came from, and Virgil says that whenever the earthquake happened and Jesus came into the 1st layer and pulled people out of hell, that the earthquake sent a rift and they're walking along the crack line of that right now. This kind of gives the overarching idea that wherever they're going throughout hell, not only are they being guided by God, but that it was all preordained for this to happen. So then, getting to the end of the path, they come to a place known as the River Phlegethon, which is a river made of boiling blood, which also explains the noxious smell from earlier. Virgil explains that this is the first part of the 3 parts within the 7th layer of hell. Here's how the 7th layer is broken up. The first part is people who committed violence against others. The second part is people who committed violence against themselves, and the third part is people who committed violence against God. So we all get the first part, violence against others, killing people, that kind of thing. However, the second part, violence against yourself, is more interesting. This is the part where I want to amplify the fact that this is not what the Catholic Church believes. According to Dante, it is worse to commit violence against yourself than someone else, because committing violence against yourself is directly denying the gift of your body and life that God has given you, and that's worse than getting angry and taking it from someone else. So because of that, people who commit suicide are on a lower level than people who killed someone else. And then the violence against God means doing unnatural things. So for example, bestiality is down there. Along with, and this is the part I really want to amplify, the church does not believe this. This is not religion. This is a man who fought in a war in the 1300s, including homosexuality, because according to Dante, that was such a violent, horrific action against God that they got to go straight to the bottom. And while in the 1300s, it was generally frowned upon, especially by members of the church, people weren't the fondest of him saying that it's worse than murder. Obviously, by today's standards, it's laughable. But if in the 1300s you could say something bad about gay people, and even the Catholic Church was like, you think you may have taken it a little too far? So as they're getting closer to the river, Dante realizes that along the riverbanks are standing centaurs with bows and arrows. Virgil explains that they're on a passage from God, and the centaurs explain that their job here is to make sure that no one crawls out of the boiling blood river. So if anyone tries to crawl out, they just shoot him with their arrow, and then they fall back into the blood. Dante rides on the back of Nessus, a character from Greek mythology, as Nessus carries Dante across the river. I imagine this to be a very romantic moment as Dante sets on his horse spine. And Nessus points out a few figures to Dante. For example, he shows him Alexander the Great, who killed a lot of people in his conquest for glory. And he points out that the river gets deeper the closer you go to the middle. So the people who are up on the sides and can still, like breathe in the boiling blood are ones like Alexander the Great. But if you get closer to the middle, there are people completely submerged, like Attila the Hun. Dante then gets off the back of Nessus, and him and Virgil begin to walk into a dark forest, which this is the second part of the seventh layer. As they're walking through the dark forest that is completely filled with dead trees, there are these things known as harpies flying back and forward. Harpies are these really terrifying human-bird amalgamations from Greek legend that are generally not a good thing. And Dante can hear screaming from everywhere, but he doesn't see anyone. Virgil then tells Dante to pull a branch off a tree, and as soon as he does, the place where the branch was starts spouting out blood and the tree starts screaming. To which Virgil explains that all of the people down here on this level, again the ones who committed suicide or harmed their own bodies, are now these trees and plants, and whenever someone like Dante breaks a branch off, that's the equivalent of ripping an arm off, and they grow fruit from themselves that the harpies eat all the time, and it's very painful. And then Virgil apologizes and tells the tree that Dante wouldn't have believed him if he had just told him and it was necessary to break the branch off, which, like, is it? Was it really though? Like, after everything Dante's seen, if Virgil was like, these trees are people, would Dante be like, get out of here? Dante asks the tree who he was, to which the tree says that he was a man by the name of Pierre, who was the advisor to King Frederick II. He said that the people convinced the king that he was a harmful advisor and trying to overthrow the king, so Pierre killed himself. To which, as Dante and Virgil are walking away, Pierre asks Dante to remember him and to clear his name in the book that he will one day write. That's again an example of the souls down here being so destitute that the only thing they can hope for is to be remembered in some capacity. So Virgil explains to Dante that the reason all these people down here are trees and bushes and all that is because whenever they were in life, they just got rid of their bodies. So now they have to spend eternity as something that is not their bodies. In other words, all these plants. But then Virgil's like, but don't you worry. Whenever Judgment Day comes, their bodies are going to come back to them. Only instead, they're going to be hung lifeless on the trees themselves. So now, instead of spending eternity as just a dead tree all there by yourself, you get a look at your lifeless corpse that is forever impaled on your pinky finger. Isn't that so much more fitting? And what's so interesting about reading this story and things of the time, a lot of us would look at that and be like, that's so horrible, they don't deserve that. But at the time, or at least as Dante's writing it, this is supposed to be a good thing. And again, Dante's journey through the story is learning that everyone is getting exactly what they deserve. So whenever in this scene, when Dante's like, I guess it is right, they have to spend eternity as a dead tree that gets half eaten all by these bird women all the time. That's supposed to be a good thing. And then while they're walking along the path from the other direction comes two men sprinting being chased by dogs, which is super weird to see two people outside of, like their pre-designated torture areas. As they're running, one of the men jumps into a bush, to which the bush screams because, again, it's a person, to which the dogs pounce on him and rip the man to pieces. We'll talk about where the two guys who were running came from in a second, but whenever Dante and Virgil walk up, the bush is like crying and screaming, asking why of all places he decided to hide inside of him. Because remember, these bushes are living things, so whenever the dogs jumped and everyone was ripping and leaves were shooting everywhere, that's pieces of this guy's body being ripped up. So Dante asks the bush who he is. That's a funny line out of context anyway. And the bush doesn't want to be remembered, but he simply says that he was a man from Florence who hung himself. So Dante, feeling pity because, again, Florence matters above everything else, starts grabbing pieces of the leaves and twigs and comes over and just kind of like lays them on top. Like, oh, sorry, man, here's your eyes and your toes and everything. Just lay that there and Good as new. So Dante and Virgil begin walking in the direction of where the two men came from, and they eventually come to a giant clearing that is filled with sand. And this clearing itself is surrounded by the dark woods that they had just walked out of. This sand pit is the third part of the seventh layer. So he sees all these naked people walking about, all moaning and groaning, and a few of them are laying down. However, Dante points out that their screams are by far the worst. He then notices that there are these flakes of fire that are falling from the sky that he describes as looking at like snowflakes. Only instead of snowflakes, they're again pieces of fire that hit the sand and make it scalding hot. So the sand that all of these people are constantly walking across is like 3rd degree burn level hot all the time. There's also a point where he looks out across the sand and there's a giant laying on it. And I know I just said the word giant, but I also realize that there may be new people watching the channel and we have to break them in easy. So anyway, the giant is laughing and essentially saying that this torture isn't so bad, to which Virgil points out that that's Capinius and he's not going to let the Roman god Jove, who killed him, have the satisfaction to know that Capinius is suffering. So it's like all these people suffering and then a Roman mythological giant, because yeah, Virgil points out that there is a river nearby that the two of them can walk along because the waters of the river make stone out of the sand that's not hot and they can walk across. However, the people on the sand cannot step off of it because, as mentioned by the two guys who ran naked through the woods earlier, dogs will find them, rip them to shreds, and then they'll just be back where they started whenever they heal up. Or at least that's why I imagine happens. Like, Dante doesn't say what happens to the guy who got ripped apart into the woods, although I highly doubt the way it works is if you get ripped up, it's like, all right, your suffering's over. You get to go home now. While walking along the bank, Dante asks Virgil where these rivers come from, to which there's this weird description that doesn't really go anywhere, but I have to mention it. It's too weird not to. Virgil says that underneath the island Crete, there's this giant creature, and again giant, that is very similar to the description of Nebuchadnezzar with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in the Bible. So in other words, it's this thing with a head of gold, a body of silver, feet of clay, and I think thighs of brass. And he says it's crying all the time underneath the island of Crete, and the tears go underground into the underworld, and that's where all these rivers come from. And that's never elaborated on. I almost feel like in some of these cases, Dante had to be sort of trolling with it. Because it's like, oh, you want to know where the water from hell comes from? Well, there's a giant stone statue thing underneath Crete, and it cries, and that's where rivers are from. Any other stupid questions? So while walking along this bank, Dante sees his old teacher, Brunetto. Dante's excited to see him and says to Brunetto, let's sit and talk a while, to which Brunetto says, no, if you sit down, you are trapped in that state for 100 years. That explains why the people laying down earlier were the ones screaming the loudest. And like, I've ragged on this story a lot, and I know I have, especially for a story that was written 800 years ago. However, that's one of the coolest, like, torture concepts I could imagine. Like, it's this flaming hot sand that you would get tired of after walking for a whole day, let alone the eons that you'd have to. But if you take a moment to rest, boom, 100 years in that position, meaning more of your body's being burnt by the sand. And then if you do eventually decide to just lay down and take 100 years of suffering, you're just stuck there. And that is so brutal. And I love it. And like, I know it may sound like up until this point I've been like, oh, this is so awful. But stuff like this made the story worth it and made me want to keep reading. And while Dante never says why Brunetto's all the way down here, and while there's many reasons to be down here in this part of the seventh layer, in the research I did, there's beliefs that he was homosexual. So Dante, feeling so driven that even though he was his teacher who he still greatly admires, he's like, oh, you're gay? Looks like you're down there below the murderers, bucko. It's also during this moment that Dante, and not the character Dante, the writer Dante, uses this moment as more of an ego pump. Like, there's that thing I mentioned earlier where the other poets were like, you're so great, you're fantastic. And here his teacher's like, wow, you sure are mature and a great writer and a good spirit. You're not afraid at all. You're one of the most driven people I know. Well, bye. And then Brunetto and the group just walk on, and Anyway, I guess, he's Dante, the guy that wrote Dante's Inferno, so who am I to make fun of him? But if you write a story like this and keep talking about how fantastic you are in it, I am absolutely that guy to come and make fun of you. Before Brunetto leaves, he asks if Dante will remember him. Again, there's that whole remembrance thing. So eventually Dante and Virgil come to the end of this waterway and it drops into a waterfall, and Virgil explains that they have to go down to get to the 8th layer of hell. As they're standing there at the waterfall, Geryon appears, which is essentially, and I know they're different, but I'm dumbing it down, is essentially a Griffith, which is the creature that is like the lion body and the human head and all of that. And while Virgil talks to the Geryon, he tells Dante to go talk to 3 other people who are standing on the edge of the sand. And whenever Dante walks up to these 3 guys who are sitting down in the sand, they're all holding these purses and just staring at him. And whenever Dante asks why they're just holding the purses, they tell him to get lost and get out of here, and they just keep staring at him. These guys are known as usurers, which again isn't really a thing now, but they were essentially loan guys, or in other words, they loan people money at high interest and then prey upon them to take it back. And Virgil talked about them earlier during their conversation before they went into the 7th layer, but I wanted to wait till now to explain it because it's so funny to me. So according to Virgil, the way the natural law of order works is people do things in the world and then they are given rewards for it. Whereas debt collectors don't do anything of worth and instead simply prey on other people and take their stuff and therefore mess with God's natural order. So Dante threw debt collectors on the final part of the 7th layer of hell. So according to Dante, the acts of violence you can commit include genocide, suicide, being gay, and charging high rent. And I'm once again stressing, this isn't a belief system. Just because he was Catholic doesn't mean the Catholics believe this. They renounced this several times. But reading it from a modern standpoint, it's so funny. Oh yeah, and in the end, the burning sand, that's where the debt collectors and all the other people who I have moral disagreements with go. And no one can tell me otherwise. Oh, you have an issue with that? Well, guess what? Your mom's in hell too. So yeah, what about it? So then Dante walks back over to Virgil and the 2 of them fly down the waterfall on the back of Geron down to the 8th layer. We then enter the 8th layer of hell, which is fraud. Again, as mentioned earlier, the idea that Dante is getting across is that God specifically hates those who betray kindness and love, so therefore fraud is so deep in hell. This 8th layer has 10 different sub-levels, and the way it's arranged is these 10 sort of stone trenches that are dug out, or these sort of pits, that different people are punished for different kinds of fraud within each one. We then come to the first trench, which is that of deceiving love. From the descriptions that he gives, this is sort of like human traffickers. For example, they come across someone and he says that he sold his sister to a lustful man. And also Jason from the story of Troy is here for betraying his lover. So those who give away love are those who betray private love. And the people within this trench are forced to run from one end of the trench to another, as devils whip them if they go too slow. So imagine an eternity of sprinting and wearing yourself out from that, and every time you slow down, you're beat and whipped relentlessly until you keep running. The second trench is for deceptive speakers, or in other words, those who use lies or boister themselves in order to get what they want. In this trench is Eliseo and Thais, again, 2 characters from Greek mythology, and this trench is a giant pit full of dung. The idea being that people who BS'd in real life are now forced to BS forever. And they're constantly fighting and pushing each other down and covered in sores all the time, and obviously the smell, not a fun party. In the third pit are the Simonists. Now that's not really a thing in modern age, but at the time it was a big deal. Simonists are people who sell sacred goods. Now as that relates to church, that means members of the church who would lie to people and have them give money when it wasn't actually going to what they said it was going to. So like as Dante describes, these are people of the church who stole money to raise people from purgatory, or quite literally sold holy sacraments for cash. It was also a thing that started around the time that church leaders would sell pardons, or in other words, if someone committed a sin, they would literally take money and say, all right, you're good now, and then send them on their way. Dante didn't like that, so they're in here too. So the way that this trench works is the ground and the bottom of the trench are on fire, and it's like these hot coals that randomly shoot up with flames. And the only way to get away from it is there's these holes in the rock that you can put your head and torso inside of. And I imagine it's just kind of like a stone coffin within there. So then your waist and feet stick out, and that's burnt, but you have some alleviation on the top part of your body. Dante sees one soul that's so horribly burnt he can't even recognize a face. And whenever he asks the soul who it is, they say that they are Pope Nicholas III. Now, Dante did not like Pope Nicholas because he was the one who started the whole thing of, oh, well, if you give me part of your money, your family member can go to heaven or whatever. So him being a charred, burnt remain just tells him off and is like, you know how much Jesus charged Peter to go to heaven? Nothing, because salvation's free, because Jesus paid for it. And you know what? I'm glad you're down here, and I'm glad you're burnt to death. And Virgil begins praising him for it, because as I mentioned earlier, the character arc is not character goes from being bad person to good person like we would think. It goes from character feeling bad for people to yelling and screaming at them and saying they deserve it. And then Nicholas mentions a really creepy fact. He asks, because, you know, his eyes are gone because he's so horribly burnt. He asks whenever Dante comes, he says, "Is that you?" And then refers to the next pope. And he explains to Dante whenever the next pope comes to take his place, that he is to crawl deeper into the hole in the rock so that the next guy can put his head through it. So are those holes just like infinite tubes full of people inside of hot rock? That's the worst one out of all of them, if that's how that works. And like the other thing is, Dante describes all of these cosmic terrors, things like that, and things like the burning sand and all that. And then he's like, and then we saw a big cat griffin thing, and that was neat, and we said bye to everyone who's been suffering for an eternity. And then there was a really cool river, and he just never mentions it. They come to the fourth trench, which is sorcerers and seers, or in other words, like witches and mystic types. And all of them have their head twisted all the way backwards, so that they forever have to walk backwards. And that's it. And what's funny is Dante begins crying at the sight of this, whereas not 30 seconds ago he was yelling at the giant scab about how awful of a person he is, and then now he sees someone walking backwards and it's just more than his heart can bear. And I guess it's because like things like that in the modern age are, I mean, not common, but we see them in horror movies so often and stuff, we don't really think anything of it. But it's weird that he describes all these bodily images, and this is the one that does him in. People walking without the use of their knees. How terrible. Also, I feel like the punishment doesn't scale, because the one we're about to talk about is way worse. Like, you've got the popes, the like pope tube with people on the outside having their feet burned up. And then we've got people walking backwards, and then the next one's a pit of boiling oil. Like, anyway, so they come to the next one, the fifth trench, which is like this boiling pit of tar. And at first, when walking around it, they don't see anyone, but then a demon runs by carrying someone on his shoulder and then dumps them into the pit of tar, and all the other demons have these big like stirring rods and just push them under. And Dante realizes, oh, there's like millions of people under there. How quaint. Virgil explains to Dante that this part is for barators, or in other words, people who exchange money for political office, or in other words, the way modern politics work. So Virgil, again using his wise words, negotiates for safe passage, because as one of the devils explained to him, there used to be bridges connecting all these trenches, but whenever Jesus did the whole like return thing and the whole earthquake happened, that destroyed the bridges, so now they need to kind of like climb their way across. While walking around the edge of the pit, Dante begins to notice that there's a few people who like swim to the surface and hide under the rock face, but whenever one of the demons come around, they dive back under. Which that's got to be, you know, a scary idea if it's like, well, back into the boiling tar I go. That's better than dealing with these guys. At one point while the devils are walking around, which also, mind you, this entire time they've been making fun of Dante, like, hey, what if we throw him in the pit? Wouldn't that be funny? And Dante's like crying and throwing up and everything. At one point as they're walking around, one of the demons stab a guy and hoist him up in the air, and Dante's trying to have a conversation with him, but every time he says something, one of the demons like pokes an organ out. Anyway, eventually there's like a moment of confusion with the demons, and the guy manages to hop off the hook back into the boiling tar. So the two demons get into a fight with each other and fall into the tar. And Dante never elaborates if they're just stuck down there forever or what. But there's two demons in the tar pit now, whatever that means. So the other demons get mad at Virgil and Dante because, I don't know, they're like, hey, get those guys now for some reason. So Virgil and Dante run and just jump into the sixth trench, which turns out is a relatively chill trench. However, it's really lucky that it was, because what if it was another boiling tar one? It's like, oh, and we're dead now. Great. All of God's journey ruined because we were running and jumped into a trench like an idiot. So they jump into the sixth trench, and it's a bunch of people with really heavy garments over them. And that's it. Like, it's just like these heavy, they look like robed people walking around in circles, and Dante points out that the outside of the robes look beautiful, but the inside is like brittle and covered in lead and stuff. It's not on fire. It's not anything extreme. They're just forced to walk around all the time in really heavy garments, but like, can they sit down? Can they like take a nap? Is this just like a bunch of weighted blankets everywhere? Dante eventually talks to two men who explain that they are friars and that this pit is for hypocrites. Hence the garment looks beautiful on the outside, but it's ugly and bristled on the inside, you get it. And while talking, Dante notices that there is a man in the middle of the room who is crucified to the floor. And the two friars explain that that is Caiaphas, the guy who had the idea to crucify Jesus. And that whenever they're walking around in the robes, that they have to step on him as his punishment for crucifying Jesus. Again, no clue if anyone's telling them to do that or if that's just like an agreement they all came to or what. And then Dante and Virgil just leave and they head on to the seventh trench. The seventh trench is by far the weirdest one, and like a lot of the language in this poem, which you can check it out, I linked it in the description itself, is hard to read in its own right. And what he's describing here is... Anyway, so the seventh trench is for thievery. And essentially in it, there are these giant lizard snake things. And they're not lizards or snakes. They're like these weird hybrid creatures that he's just trying to describe that have these stingers on them. And he watches one of them sting a guy that's running around, and he's bound up by snakes. So there's a guy bound by snakes running around in this pit of giant snake lizard things, and one of them stings him, and he falls over and turns to ash. Then all of the ash reforms and he comes back together. And that just keeps happening on a loop. Dante goes down there and asks the guy who he is, and the guy doesn't want to say, and eventually confesses that he stole from a church. Because again, this seventh trench is thievery. So then during the conversation, he curses God, and as soon as he does, a series of snakes come and begin to wrap him up. And as they're wrapping him, Dante's talking about how much he hates him and how deserving he is of this punishment. So I want you to imagine Dante standing there at the edge of a trench he just came to. This guy's probably been suffering for, 200-300 years. And Dante is like asking him what happened. And then the guy is like, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of God. And immediately snakes wrap all around him. And as he's laying there like suffocating, frothing at the mouth, Dante's like, I cannot believe your insolence. Well, let me tell you, as someone of a higher position, that you are wrong. Good day, sir. This is the really weird part that's hard to describe. So these three souls come up to him, and then they all sort of like scream or cry out for something. And the description that Dante gives, to the best of my ability, is like this worm with legs comes to one of the souls and like burrows inside of it. And then like the soul flips around and becomes this lizard thing. And then, I'm not kidding, read it yourself. And then another one of the souls, this like turtle comes up to, and they both breathe. No, it bites the soul on the chest and smoke comes out of the chest. And then the smoke becomes a snake, and then the other one like gets eaten by a scorpion thing or whatever and becomes a spider. That's the best I can do. Like, it's this weird long description of these three people flipping in and out, and I'm sure it's this really cool cosmic horror, but the way Dante describes it gets me a little bit. He specifically says, the things that I saw were so great and so amazing that they would put any poet to shame, and that the sights here were more amazing than any man could ever dare to imagine. And like, if this was real, sure, I get it. But Dante here, and he specifically brings up like old Roman and Greek poems and is like, this is cooler than what those guys had. So he's pretty much right into being like, wow, it'd take a pretty cool guy to come up with this stuff, which is definitely real and not made up by a really cool guy. And I think what he's describing is that the souls down here constantly have their bodies stolen by these spirit or like lizard things that are running around everywhere. Or like they're constantly switching bodies. I don't know. Weird stuff is happening in the thief pit. So anyway, they come out of that pit and then they go to the 8th one, which whenever they see it, it's like this long expansive area. And there's these little fires everywhere that Dante describes as looking as fireflies. And then Virgil's like, yeah, underneath every one of those little fires you see is a soul burning all the time. These are the evil leaders and counselors, or in other words, people who led others to death or treachery with their leadership. For example, one person down here is Ulysses from the Trojan horse story, who says that after all of that happened, he decided to get all of his men together and sail across the seas forever. However, at the time, 1300, they thought that the world ended at a certain point. So his story is that Ulysses went too far and literally went off the map and everyone with him died. So now he's punished down here because he led men to death with his own insolence. One very interesting person down here is Guido da Montefeltro. And again, Guido's a real historical figure, but according to him, Pope Boniface VIII had asked him to be a soldier in his army, and Guido had said that he doesn't want to do that because he's repentant and doesn't want to go to war, but the Pope said that he will give him a pardon in advance if he fights in the Papal War. However, whenever Guido died, a demon took him, saying that you cannot be pardoned for a sin you had not yet committed, because that implies that you regret it. However, if you regret something in advance before you do it, that's not actually regretting it. That's the equivalent of being like, I'm sorry before you punch somebody. And apparently, and again, I'm not an expert on medieval times religion or whatever, but apparently this was a thing that was happening within Catholic churches. People would get pardons in advance. So again, Dante including him in this tier of hell is another political jab. They come to the 9th trench, which according to Dante is an endless sea that looks like all the carnage from every war in history. It is just arms and legs and bodies and heads and everything else ripped to shreds. Virgil explains that these are the sowers of discord, or in other words, people who have purposefully caused trouble. And that what happens is these demons come around and they pick people up and they just rip them into as many pieces as they want and then throw them back in there. And because this is hell, no one can die. So if your head gets ripped in half and you're just a disembodied head, well, you just gotta lay there forever and then have piles of other body parts thrown on top of you, and you can still feel all your limbs, and it's like that forever. He mentions a few people being down here, most of them people he personally knew from Florence because he does that a lot, as well as the Prophet Muhammad from the religion of Islam, because as you could imagine, Dante didn't really care for Islam, so yeah, he put him in there too. Among the carnage, he sees something like a man who's had his entire mouth and jaw ripped off and can't speak. He saw another man who had his head cut off and was walking around holding his own hair. And whenever he comes to talk to Dante, he's like, hey, talk to it. He's like, hey, talk to it. There's also this weird line where Dante mentions to Virgil, oh, I should have a family member down here. And Virgil's like, yeah, he was there. You just didn't recognize him because he was skinned alive. And Dante's like, oh, all right, on to the next part. They then get to the 10th trench, which is different. As on their way there, it becomes pitch black, and Dante has to cover his ear from the shriekings that he's hearing. This is the trench of liars and falsifiers. In other words, those who have completely lied outright in order to gain from it. He says that the people in this trench not only experience total darkness, but illnesses of that far beyond earth, or in other words, a constant pestilence. He says he sees people covered in these giant scabs that he compares to fish scales all over their body, that they constantly itch and rip off and bleed everywhere just to continue to scratch before the scabs grow back and they do it over again. He meets a man by the name of Griffolino, who was an alchemist. In other words, he would fake precious metals and then sell them as real, like gold and silver, as well as to rabid people who run around frothing at the mouth, biting other people and themselves, saying that the pestilence here is so strong, people have even lost their minds. He comes across a counterfeiter who made fake money, who is hideously bloated and constantly thirsty with no way to get water. And then also down there is Potiphar's wife, who is a Bible character that lied about Joseph in order to have him be thrown in prison. Also, two of them get into a fight, and at this point Dante's so giddy about all this torture stuff that he enjoys the fight, and then Virgil rebukes him and says, no, don't enjoy their fighting, but it's good that they're suffering, but don't enjoy it too much, and then they leave. So then, walking out of the 8th layer of hell, they walk into this corridor that's incredibly dark. Dante begins to make out in the darkness something that he describes as towers, but as he gets closer, he realizes that these are not towers. Instead, these are giants, I'm controlling myself, who are stuck in the ground from their stomach down, or in other words, it's just the top half sticking out. And all of these giants are in a circle around a huge well. There is one giant by the name of Nimrod who is blowing a trumpet, but whenever he tries to speak to the pair, what he says is completely indiscernible. Virgil explains that Nimrod had the idea to build the Tower of Babel in the Bible, which is the tower that people try to build in order to get to heaven, and for his insolence, he's been punished that no one can ever understand him. Eventually, they come across a giant named Antaeus, who is not frozen or stuck in any regard, and ask for his help to go down the well. Initially, Antaeus is afraid to go down to the 9th layer, but then Dante says that he can make him famous by writing about him in the story. So Antaeus agrees, and he holds out his hand, to which the two men climb onto it. Gives you a scope for how big this giant is. He then climbs down the well and drops them off onto a frozen lake. They are now in the 9th layer of hell, treason. As the previous 2 layers, it is subdivided this time into 4 parts. The first part is kindred or family betrayal. The second part is country or homeland betrayal. The third part is betrayal of guests and friends. And the fourth part is betrayal to God. As soon as they get there, Dante hears a voice say, "Be careful where you step, you may step on a sinner." To which Dante pulls back and realizes that he is standing on a giant frozen lake that has heads popping up out of it. And all of the heads are living people who are permanently frozen, unable to move from the neck down. As people cry, the tears freeze across their face, and it's so cold that several people have ears frozen off and are in a permanently pale state of existence. While walking and stepping over all of the heads, he comes across these 2 men who have their hair knotted together so they're forever touching forehead to forehead. Another soul explains that these are 2 brothers who killed themselves in the real world, so now they are forced to ever be stuck together and unable to do anything about it. Virgil then says they need to continue walking, as he says they are walking towards the center of this frozen lake, which is the center of hell itself. Now, something to explain about why the 9th layer is composed this way. The idea being the least offensive treason is that a family, because family is something that you're born into. So while you're still supposed to maintain ties, the love there isn't as strong as the love one would give to a friend or God. The second is country, because country is something that one, or at least Dante figured, someone should be so loyal to that it should surpass that of family. The third being friends and guests, because those are bonds that you have chosen to make and entirely rely on trust, so betraying that is a massive sin against humanity. And then finally, a treacherous act against God. The idea being that since God is perfect, any treacherous act comes from a pure place of malice on your behalf. So as they walk closer to the center, I can't really see in the writing a difference between, the ones who, because in the 8th tier, there were individual trenches. It was easy to see, these people, these people, these people. It seems like here it's just continuing and nothing's changed. The only mention was there was a line about the faces were purple. So maybe it's even colder here, but it's still just head sticking out, so whatever. While walking, Dante kicks someone's head on accident, who gets mad, and he's like, why are you torturing me? I'm being tortured enough. Leave me alone. And whenever Dante asks him who he is, the head doesn't respond. So Dante gets down on the ground and grabs his hair and says, if you don't tell me who you are, I'll rip your hair out. Like, that is a wild change from the Dante that we saw like an hour ago. Like, this guy went from passing out at the thought of two people kind of floating around in the wind to now he's like, if you don't tell me who you are, I'm going to rip your frozen hairs off one by one. So as this is going on, a head nearby tells Dante that that man is a traitor to Florence. Dante does not like that one bit and tells the frozen man that he's going to write about him in his story, and everyone for all of history will know that he's a traitor to Florence, forever cursed to freeze in hell. He keeps walking and comes across two people who are frozen, one's head up against the back of another, and the one who's pressed up against the back is eating the head of the man in front of him. Dante kneels down and asks what this is all about, and to answer him, the guy that is eating the other guy wipes his mouth on the hair of the guy in front of him and then begins to tell his story. He tells Dante that he himself was a count, and the man whose head he's eating was an archbishop who in life condemned him and his sons into a dungeon where they all starved to death. He gives a grueling account of how he was thrown in there for betraying the city of Pisa, and even though he deserved the treachery, also throwing his sons in there was a treacherous act, and it's heavily, or at least he heavily implies, that he ate his sons as they were about to die. Like, that's how hungry he was. So he tells Dante, now the man is forever cursed to be the victim of my hunger, and then he just goes back to eating the guy's head. To which Dante, the takeaway he has from that is he stands up and he's like, Pisa is such a horrible city. I can't believe Pisa is this evil. Could you imagine that? And again, this is the thing that's so weird to me about this. He is in the 9th circle of hell. He has gone where quite literally no man has been before, standing above someone eating someone else's head for eternity. And he's like, man, Pisa really has to get their social climate in order. So then they continue on walking, and they get to the third part of the 9th layer, which is the traitors to guess. Again, because that's entirely bounded on trust, and they broke that trust. These people are different because instead of frozen upright, they're frozen lying on their backs, which means not only do they not have anyone to look at and they never know who's around them, but whenever they cry, instead of the ice kind of pouring down like icicles, it covers their whole face until eventually they're stuck in this frozen mask. It's also at this point that Dante begins to feel a rush of wind, like a gentle breeze happening, and he asks Virgil what it is, and Virgil's like, we'll get to it when we get to it. One person who has their face completely frozen in tears asks Dante to help him, and Dante says he will if the man tells him his story. The man frozen on the ground explains that he is Friar Alberigio, which is someone that Dante knows back on Earth. The friar explains that he invited a guest over to his house and murdered him. Dante's confused though because the friar is still alive on Earth, to which the soul explains that if someone commits a sin so heinous that it puts them in the 9th circle of hell, the moment that they commit it, their soul is sucked to hell and their body is filled with a demon. And that's where possessions come from. This is an insanely cool concept to me, like the idea of souls being switched if someone commits an act so heinous against humanity. And guess what Dante's takeaway is from it? That's right, Italian politics. So then, remember, Dante made the deal, tell me who you are, I'll break the ice off your face. And then Dante goes, you know what? No, I'm not going to break the ice on your face. You know why? Because this is what you deserve. And then he stands up and recounts that this man is from Genoa, and he's like, Genoa is such a terrible place that a friar can be possessed and no one could tell the difference. Imagine living in Genoa. Wouldn't that be awful? Like the man just described, there are sins so heinous that a demon possesses your corpse and now they exist in the realm of the living. And his takeaway is that Genoa, not the best place to live. They then continue walking, and Dante says they eventually get to a place where souls are completely frozen beneath the ice. As in not just their heads sticking out and they cry, their entire body frozen forever in various positions that he can see beneath the ice as they walk across it. And then finally, they come to the fourth part of the ninth layer of hell, the bottom of the pit itself. As they get close, Virgil explains to Dante the wind that he was feeling earlier that's much stronger now is the wind off of Lucifer's wings as he flaps them. Whenever they get to Lucifer himself, he is massive. As a matter of fact, Dante says that he himself, Dante, is closer in size to the giants than the giants were to the size of Lucifer, implying him to be this monumental mountain-sized figure. Lucifer himself has 3 heads, the one on the right being a dark blackish color, the middle one being deep blood red, and the left one being a bright burning yellow. And from each of those faces pours blood and tears from the eyes that run down his body and create a sort of river. There are 4 people in this bottom pit of hell. The first, as mentioned, is Lucifer. Lucifer for betraying humanity and betraying God. The 2 on either sides of the heads are Brutus and Cassius. Now, that may not mean much to a lot of you, but for my boys who know about Rome, that's a pretty big deal. Brutus and Cassius are the 2 members of the Senate who conspired to murder Caesar. In other words, ending the original Roman Empire, which, as I mentioned earlier, Dante thought pretty highly of. So Caesar himself sat on a throne in the first circle of hell as such a great man, and now the 2 people who conspired to murder him and destroyed the Roman Empire are stuck here as well. The 2 of them hang within the right and left sides of Lucifer's heads, with their top half hanging out as they are constantly chewed, and Lucifer reaches up with claws and scratches them for all eternity. So non-stop within the mouth of Satan, snarling as he bites at you forever. And then finally, in the middle head of Lucifer, the most punished man in all of hell is Judas Iscariot. He is instead facing towards the throat of Lucifer, and Dante says he can see his spine and bones as all the skin has been stripped away. Judas is here for betraying Jesus Christ and leading to the crucifixion of Jesus. So not only for betraying Jesus himself, but for betraying humanity's second attempt at perfection. Virgil explains to Dante that now that they have made it to the bottom of hell and they've seen everything that needs to be seen, it's now time to climb their way out. So Virgil carries Dante on his back and waits for an opportune moment to grab onto the side of Lucifer and begin climbing up him. Virgil's climbing for a while before jumping off of Lucifer onto a rock face, and then Dante opens his eyes, and instead of seeing, Lucifer's chest as if he was climbing up, he sees Lucifer's legs sticking up as if everything's been flipped upside down. Virgil explains that this entire time they've been traveling towards the center of the earth, and now they've passed the barrier where gravity has flipped, and they are now climbing their way out. Virgil says that they are climbing their way to the southern hemisphere, which is almost entirely made of water. According to him, whenever Lucifer was cast out of heaven, all of the land moved away from him, and he shot a straight hole all the way from the heavens to the center of the earth, where he got stuck going through, and that's the reason he's now frozen, setting up, chewing on Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. So all that they have to do is tunnel their way out the hole that Lucifer originally made whenever he got shot in. The waters from the oceans, because again, as Virgil said, the land moved away from him, so now it's pretty much just water up there. The waters from these oceans burrow their way down, and Dante says that this water coming through is the river Lethe from Greek mythology. And then they finally pop out, as Dante says, at the exact opposite point on Earth from where they started. So they made a direct line through the entire Earth, with the final line of Dante's Inferno being, "Thence we came forth to re-behold the stars," meaning they're finally out on the surface and can once again see the stars. Not only that, but they've popped out at the foot of Mount Purgatory, or in this legend, the mountain on which purgatory exists, which makes sense at this time in history because, again, they hadn't really explored anything outside of their hemisphere, so they thought, well, if purgatory is going to be anywhere, it might as well be on the other side of the earth. So them coming out on the surface at the foot of Mount Purgatory is the setup for the second part of Divine Comedy, Purgatorio. So after all of that, after I read and described to you the entirety of Dante's Inferno, how do I feel about it? It was alright. I mean, there are some interesting points while reading it. like some conclusions I came to that I think are interesting, especially from a modern perspective. For one, and I mentioned this a lot, the journey of Dante from being pity to pious is so interesting to me. Because whereas we hear that whole thing near the end in tier 9 with the guy with the frozen tears on his face, who Dante's like, if you tell me who you are, I'll uncover your face. And then after he tells him, Dante's like, no, you're a bad soul. You deserve to have your face covered in frozen tears forever. That is like a heroic moment. That is Dante's character arc from being weak and passing out to being like, nope, they deserve it. This is all right. And I'm following what God wants me to do by saying that they should suffer more. I like that idea. It was also really interesting, the ideas of like fame throughout the entire story, because it's like a cool concept by modern standards. It's wild that in the 1300s, Dante managed to have these ideas where these suffering souls are just like, please remember me, or just show me some form of remembrance, which was entirely out of character for any storytelling at the time. So I think it's really interesting to see it put forward as much here. And what's interesting is once he got to like the 8th and 9th layer of hell, they didn't want him to know who he was, because then it goes from fame to infamy. Also, there's kind of the combined message that you probably picked up on listening to this, that Dante had a very heightened sense of Christianity above everything else. Like, yeah, he had all the Greek and the Roman gods, and like you mentioned Muhammad, that's an Islamic figure, right, and all that, but they're all within his idea of what hell is in the Christian canon. So therefore, it's like, yeah, you know, you can all be real, whatever, but you're in my hell. So, as well as the entire story itself being both a political and personal tool. Like, it's a political tool in the fact of, like, the army he's waging against. He's like, oh, you don't like me? Well, King Frederick II is in the heretic level of hell now. And, oh, you think he's your actual king? Well, I guess you're wrong. Oops. And also the personal stuff, like, not only the fact that Virgil, his hero, basically, guides him through the whole journey, but the fact all these other poets and his old teacher are like, wow, you're so great, you're so smart. And the woman he loved in life being the angel that comes down to him. Like, it's weird that for the time, I think about it, I'm like, yeah, that's fine, like 1300, whatever. But it's hilarious writing tropes by today's standards. I made the joke biblical fanfic, but it really got that way sometimes. Like, I don't know. It's so weird because you would think from a storytelling perspective, and it's not like this is Dante's first story either. He wrote a bunch of other stuff. But you would think from a storytelling perspective, there would be this hindrance to add so many personal layers to it. But personally, I think part of his bitterness, because he was exiled at this time, came through in this story where he's just like, well, this person's in hell and this one is too. And I get the girl and all the poets say they love me. And like, the whole feeling of this sort of malevolent benevolence exists throughout the story, because he talks about all these people suffering and how it's good. Like even the inscription on the gate of hell at the beginning, where it talks about divine justice and primal love made me. And the idea like everything you're about to see is exactly what they get and it's what they deserve. And like, honestly, Dante's entire character journey was coming to terms with that fact. It's like the opening inscription on the gate is the end destination for his character. And not only that, but with things like the inscription on the gate, the power of words has such an important, like, it's an asset in this story, because there's so many, and I made jokes about it, but anytime something happens, Virgil's like, God sent us, and they just get what they want. And like when it came to the city, whenever the angel had to come and tap open the door, like the one time words didn't work, an angel did it, and every other time words did what they needed it to. And all these souls who have been suffering in hell for who knows how long just want Dante to talk about them in his poetry, which, yeah, kind of haughty to be in a story and be like, but these souls were relieved to know that I, the great Dante, would write about them. But it does show how Dante valued words and ideas, which whenever you're reading it kind of gives you an idea for why he included a lot of the details he did. For example, Dante thinks of poetry and writing as these great standings of moral character, so whenever he writes about someone being in hell, he wants that to be seen as a big deal. So how did I feel about it? By a modern standard, if someone wrote this today, I would be like, it's like okay, right? Because it's still interesting, the concepts of hell, but in other times, it's incredibly biased, not only with things I mentioned, like who goes to the seventh layer of hell is really weird and like old world philosophy thinking, but also with details about like who is in those layers of hell specifically, like all of them across the board. It's, like I said, it's a political tool, a lot of it. And a lot of the times the stories like this, you got to realize, you know, Dante was part of a war. There are people who take some of this too seriously. A good example of it is William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, which is a fantastic play, and Shakespeare is a great writer, but people have taken that story and they have made that their history, right? Like they have taken that opinion and been like, yeah, this is what happened. They were definitely remorseful for it. And Mark Antony definitely felt this way about it and all that stuff. And people do that with Dante's Inferno sometimes. Like they'll read it and they'll read about these old popes and be like, I guess Pope Nicholas III was just an evil guy. Wherein, you know, history is more complicated than just Dante's opinion of it. So it's weird that it's kind of become like a historical footnote, and understandably because of how big of a piece it is. But it's weird that the facts that Dante says in it itself have kind of become not canonical, so to speak, but revered. And I think that's kind of weird, but whatever. But I will say, for the time that it was written, this thing is an absolute masterpiece. To have no knowledge of these greater concepts of fear and horror and body disfigurement, and I'm talking about this from like a horror guy perspective, or like a film bro perspective, you could say, like the ideas of these body amalgamations and the transformation scene I kind of ragged on because he talked it up. But in all honesty, it was like an insanely weird scene to describe. Things that would be insane for a modern director to get across. The fact he did it in 1317 blows my mind. And like these descriptions of hell, like I mentioned, are incredibly relevant today, not only in things like video games, like there's a Dante's Inferno video game, but stuff like As Above, So Below, or the majority of depictions of hell that use one, if not more, of these elements to get their point across. For what it is, I think it's incredibly interesting, and whenever there's something like this, I love going back to the source and seeing like where it all came from. Because even in reading this, and I once again want to emphasize, I have not only Dante's Inferno itself linked in the description, but a sort of Spark Notes guide to help you understand, because a lot of the English is older English. But while reading it, there were so many elements I found that I couldn't mention all in this video that made me go, oh, that's where this comes from. That's where that idea comes from. And as much as I rag on him, as much as there's ridiculous stuff in the story for nowadays, for what it was at the time, it was a marvel. And I think it's something that should still be looked at today, and I enjoyed reading it. But you know I enjoyed even more than reading it? That's right, talking to you guys about it. And I hope that you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. It is the start of Halloween, and there's going to be more like direct line Halloween stuff like horror ARGs and all that coming out soon. But like I've wanted to cover this for a while, and was kind of putting it off, and I'm like, October's a good time to do it, because it is spooky. There's a lot of spooky ideas in there, body horror stuff and all that. So I wanted to do it now, and hopefully you enjoyed. I have absolutely no idea what this video is going to cut down to. It has been, it's currently 6 in the morning. I've been recording since like 2 a.m. It's been 4.5 hours. So I have no idea what this will cut down to. So hopefully you, also if you're surprised by that time that I've been recording, that's just how YouTubers operate. Ask anyone. There is no sleep. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. I love talking about this stuff. Like, I like weird history and I like weird horror, and this is like a good mix of the two. And it was so fun to research. And like, this is a thing that I've been blessed with because of you guys. I don't want to enforce it, but there are people who make the dad jokes, and sometimes I do feel like a dad, because I'll be researching and, for example, get to what was one in this video? Oh, the suicide forest thing. We're like, haha, suicide forest, where the trees are like bodies and all that. I was reading about that, and I'm like, man, I can't wait to tell everyone, because like I get excited to relay this information to you guys, because you all are always so funny in the comments and say the funniest stuff about it. And I love not, because it used to be I would find this stuff and be like, that's neat, and then never be able to talk about it. And now I can talk about it, and like you guys enjoy it, and that's so cool to me. So I hope that you enjoyed this, and I love that I have the ability and the blessing to be able to tell you about it. So I know I say thank you for watching a lot, but thank you for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing to all my subscribers. I think we broke 640,000, which is something like 20,000 subs over the last video. And like at the rate you guys are doing it, I can't, like it's none of it's real at this point. Like, if it seems like I'm less reactive now than I was in previous milestones, that's because this is all fake now, and I'm just imagining it, and this is all a fever dream. But thank you for supporting that dream. I also want to say, above all else, a massive thank you to my patrons. Thank you to my top patrons that you can see here. I love you guys so much. You give me the ability to do this. You give me the ability to do this full time. And the fact that I can bring videos like this to you, and then people support me monetarily, means more than I could ever describe. So thank you all so much for that. So upcoming, it's going to be spooky videos for the rest of the month. I know I've got an ARG to cover that actually may be out before this. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure what after that, but we'll see. However, I hope whatever comes, I hope that you enjoy, and that should do it. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.